Another week came and went. Krista's routine fell back into a rhythm. She occupied the last cushion on the couch. A cell phone sat on her lap. Her forefinger tapped steadily. It made a clicking sound every time her nail hit the blank screen. She left her elbow resting on the arm of the couch, and her hand held her chin in a position that reflected her boredom. Krista's life over the past 6 months had been anything but boring. After her father's funeral, the hopeless search for her husband consumed her every waking moment. She thought about him constantly. Would he come back? Would he try to kill her? Would he take Alexis? Would he hurt their child? Every second of every day, Krista assured herself Christian was somewhere in the city, stalking her. He could be outside her window or watching the apartment. Was he around, patiently waiting for the opportunity to strike? She wouldn't feel safe until he was caught, locked up, and hidden away from her and her child, Christian's child. A vice closed around her abdomen. Her gaze drifted to the space in front of the TV where Alexis watched Disney's Frozen for what seemed like the billionth time. Krista's mind wandered as she thought about her daughter's future. Was it hereditary? Would Alexis grow up to be an out-of-control maniac like her father, or a spineless wimp like her mother? Either way, Lexi's future was doomed. "Krista!" her mother yelled from the kitchen. Krista tore her eyes off of her daughter, twisted, and glanced over the back of the couch. "Yeah?" Brenda held up a mug. "Do you want some coffee?" Krista shrugged. She might as well pretend her life was normal. Sure. Coffee started most people's mornings. Normal days meant going through the motions. Wake up early, drink coffee, talk about the headlines on the front page of the New York Times, off to work, and so on. Krista's cheek twitched when she smacked her lips. It wasn't her life, but it sounded good. She didn't read the morning paper, and she didn't work. Her mother's military retirement and her father's insurance policy took care of the bills. Krista pushed herself off the couch and walked to the kitchen. She leaned over the counter. Brenda poured a cup and put it in front of her. Krista took it, wrapped her hands around the cup, and savored its warmth. She watched the dark liquid consume the cup like a black, bottomless void. "Do we have any milk?" "Check the fridge," her mother answered. She tipped the pot over a second cup. Krista walked across the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. She took out the gallon and poured a small amount into her coffee. She put the milk back and looked over her shoulder as she took out a spoon from the drawer. Krista wanted to talk to her mother, but didn't want to end up in an argument. She had to be careful about how this discussion began. "I was thinking," Krista paused mid-sentence to gather her words, "maybe Detective Weiss isn't handling the case well." Brenda furrowed her brow and headed to the dining room table with her cup of steaming coffee. "How do you mean?" "Well, I think he may need some help." Krista followed her mother to the table and sat in the chair opposite the older woman. "He doesn't seem to be handling the case with a sense of urgency." "A sense of urgency?" "Yes, and I think the authorities might need some outside help." "Help?" "Yes." Krista took a sip of hot coffee and cringed as she burnt her tongue. "Careful, that's hot." Brenda narrowed her eyes. "What have you got planned?" "Nothing." Krista sat back in her chair, watching her mother's every move. She had to be careful about how she proceeded. One wrong word and they'd be yelling at each other like a couple of parents at a high school football game. At least for now, her mother kept an open mind. Brenda raised her brow and took a slow sip from the edge of her mug. "Come on, out with it." "Out with what?" Krista asked, a little too innocently. "You've come up with some harebrained idea to annoy the police." Krista lowered her eyes to her coffee. "I did some checking." "I knew it," Brenda said through a sigh. "Why won't you just let the police handle this? It's their job to do the checking. That's what they get paid for." "I know, but listen," Krista said a little more defensively than she intended. "I just made a couple of calls, and I think I might be on to something." "Like what? What exactly are you trying to prove?" Her mother thought about it for a few seconds. "Who did you call?" Krista frowned. She wasn't trying to prove anything. Her mother's open mind had slammed shut within a matter of seconds. "A couple of his friends. Did one of them tell you where Christian is?" Krista paused. "Well, no, not really." "So?" Brenda drew out the word over a long breath. "What did they say?" "Most of his friends told me they hadn't seen or heard from him." What did you find out? Brenda asked, genuinely curious. When I talked to Kate, she told me he'd called 4 times over the last 6 months, and every time he called it was from a different number. Krista leaned forward and rested her elbows on the table. The first 3 numbers had been from random areas of the city, but the last call had been made from someone's house. I got the number and called it. Brenda was curious. Did someone answer? A woman. Brenda stared at her daughter, slack-jawed. You're kidding. No. Krista sipped her coffee. Can you believe it? He has practically gotten away with murder. The cops sit around and do nothing while I sit at home and take care of our child. What did she say? Her mother asked. Krista shook her head. She asked me who I was and why I was calling. When I asked to talk to Christian, she hung up on me. She clenched her fist. I know he's there. I just know it. If he was there, Brenda reasoned, I doubt he still is. Did you tell her who you were? No. I just asked to talk to Christian. What if he is still there? Brenda sat back with her hands still around her mug. If you think you might be onto something, call Detective Weiss and tell him what you know. I tried to do that yesterday. He wouldn't answer his phone. Call him again. I intend to, but I thought maybe you could call him. Brenda started shaking her head even before Krista finished the sentence. Fine, Krista grunted. She got up and went back to the living room. Alexis still sat in front of the television, enchanted with Elsa's musical number. Krista grabbed her cell phone from the corner of the couch. She walked to her room, closed the door, and attempted to make the conversation as private as possible. She quickly dialed, and on the second ring, the police station's secretary, Becky, answered. New York Police Department. This is Becky. Detective Jonathan Weiss, please. May I ask who's calling? Krista tried to sound calm. I would like to remain anonymous. Please let him know I have a tip that relates to one of his cases. She knew anonymity was the only way the receptionist would transfer her. Hold, please. Thank you. Krista held her breath as she waited for the familiar voice of Detective Weiss. He obviously wouldn't be happy to hear from her given their last conversation, but she had to give the information to someone who'd follow the lead. Detective Weiss, a man answered. Hello, Detective. I have an anonymous tip concerning the Christian Adams case, and Crime Relief told me you were the man in charge of the investigation. The lie was feeble, but it might be enough to get him to listen. Is this Krista Adams? Or perhaps not. Krista thought quickly, but knew almost immediately her second of silence had given her away. Mrs. Adams, your acts are beginning to strike me as pitiful. Pitiful? And as I told you the last time, I'll call you when I have information concerning your husband. No, I have information for you, he sighed into the receiver. I told you before to let us do our job. But this information could help lead to his capture. You are not an investigator, you're a victim. Krista pushed down her rising anger. I don't want to be a victim. I'm sorry. He paused. I can give you the number of a good psychiatrist. She works on the... I don't need a psychiatrist, Krista shot back. I need answers. I'm sorry, I can't help you. I'm not looking for help. I want you to listen to me. Goodbye, Mrs. Adams. Don't hang up, I have information. Krista's words drifted into silence as the phone died in her ear. She sat, dumbfounded, on the foot of her bed. She held the dead phone, hoping Weiss's voice would suddenly shout, Gotcha! And ask for her information. She listened, but no one spoke to her from the dead air. Frustration boiled in her gut. The pressure threatened to burst like steam from a hot kettle. She wanted to scream, to throw her phone through the window just to hear the satisfying sound as the glass shattered under the impact. Krista didn't want to begin to imagine that conversation with her mother. Instead, she tossed the phone onto her desk. It slid, disrupted a stack of papers, and fell to the floor. A small black object fell with it. Krista couldn't believe the detective hung up on her. How could someone who was supposed to uphold the law, to serve and protect the people, ignore a citizen who tried to give information? The more she thought about it, the angrier she got. A groan escaped her as she slammed her fist against the mattress. She had information, real information. Why wouldn't he listen to her? A sharp ringing cut through her frustration. Krista looked down at her cell phone. The ringtone was muffled by the thick carpet. Detective Weiss? Had he changed his mind? Krista reached for the phone. She didn't see why he wouldn't want to hear what she had to say. His job was to gather information for the case. Finally, he'd come to his senses. Krista decided she would be the bigger person and accept his apology without giving him any trouble. When she grabbed the phone and read the display, her heart jumped. Unknown number? She furrowed her brow. That eliminated Detective Weiss. He wouldn't call from an unlisted number. Who else had this number? Who else would call her? Curiosity got the best of her as she moved her thumb to answer the call. Hello? A deep, disappointed sigh answered and blew a wave of static into her ear. What are you doing? 4 simple words made Krista's blood stop flowing. She slowly slid off the bed, sank to her knees, and leaned against the frame for support. Her hand began to shake as she willed herself to keep the phone close to her ear. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 6 months, the voice of a man who still plagued her nightmares. Christian. She pushed the name off her tongue in a whisper. Are you looking for me? He kept his voice low, playing with her fears. Krista's pulse quickened. You talked to Kate. You asked about me. Are you looking for me? I was trying, Krista stammered. She didn't know what to say, didn't know what he wanted to hear. You keep looking, he paused and took a slow breath, and I'll find ways to hurt you. I know how to find you. Krista raised her eyes to the window. Was he watching her? You don't want me to find you, Christian warned. I know where you live. I know where you shop. I know where your mother shops. One day, when you least expect it, when you think she's safe, I'll find her and I'll kill her, just like your father. Krista felt numb, as if a clamp had closed around her chest. How did he get this number? Christian took a slow breath. Then, I'll kill you. Silence followed. The only sound was his slow, steady breath in her ear. Krista? The sound made her jump like a sudden bark from a growling dog. She tried to take the shakiness out of her voice. What? She failed. Do we understand each other? Yes, she whispered quickly. She just wanted the conversation to end. The phone clicked in her ear. Krista kept her eyes on the window. She wasn't safe. During the last 6 months, she had hoped the worst was over. The most agonizing part of her life was waiting for the police to find him. Now her worst fears slowly merged with her reality. As long as he was out there, he could find her, and he could still find ways to hurt her. Krista dropped the phone into her lap. Her eyes sank to the floor. They locked on the little black square object that stood out against the beige carpet. The rough fibers brushed on her palm as she leaned forward, her fingers closed around the matchbook. It twisted in her hand, taking on a mind of its own. The phone number across the bottom stood out in yellow numerals. It dared her to make the call. She had tried the police. They didn't consider finding Christian a priority. She had tried searching on her own. That had drawn unwanted attention. Perhaps Nick was right. She needed someone who would make finding her husband their top priority. If she waited too much longer, Christian might make this new woman his next victim. She needed to prevent anyone else from waking up in the hospital with a fractured skull. If Krista planned to call, she needed to do it before she lost her nerve. Krista dialed. She wondered if it was too early to call. It was only 11:15 in the morning. Nick was probably at home, sleeping in, completely oblivious to a phone ringing in the bar. She wanted him to answer. If he didn't, Krista knew she wouldn't have the nerve to try a second time. Finally, on the 5th ring, a masculine voice responded. Nick's. Krista swallowed hard. Hi, Nick. You might not remember me. My name is Krista. We sat and talked a few nights ago. Yes, I remember. How could I forget? Krista smiled. I'm calling to, it's concerning your offer. I would appreciate if you'd give your friend a call. I'd like to set up a meeting.